Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Mans, and I'd like to welcome you to the April 4th Coalition show. If I'm correct, this is the April 26th, 2021 edition of the show. It is week 347 and the 282nd show. I'm saying if I'm correct because I believe we took last week off to celebrate Patriots Day, which of course is one of the Massachusetts holidays. The April 4th Coalition's mission statement is, we are for workers' rights and collective bargaining rights, and are against tax breaks for the rich and corporations who ship our jobs overseas. We support all the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but as is our custom, we emphasize Article 23 at the start of the show. Rich, you're number one.
Number one, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and protection against unemployment.
Number two, everyone without any discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work.
Number three, everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for herself or himself and his or her family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection.
Number four, everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of her or his interests. And as is our custom, we thank Michael Putnam, who is the program director for the local radio station, WNNBLP 107.1. Mike has been airing the audio portion of our show on Friday nights at 6 p.m. for close to 2 years now. So we thank him for spreading the word in another way.
And we welcome Professor Emeritus of Sociology, Maynard Cedar, to this evening's program again. I hope he joins us every opportunity he can.
Thank you.
Welcome, Maynard.
Good to be here. Hi.
Is it cold in Philadelphia?
It's a beautiful day. Just took a really nice walk in a big park in Philly.
Ooh.
It's very nice.
That's wonderful.
I went out the door today with shorts on, turned around and went back and put long pants on. I looked at the temperature, but I didn't understand how windy it was. So It's cold. Yeah. It was cold here.
That makes a difference.
Yeah, we had the wonderful wind chill. It wasn't bad temperature-wise, just wind chill.
Yeah.
We miss having Mike here with us. He's doing the best he can. He has problems with physical problems that stops him from being able to participate, but we look forward to when he can.
That's what happens when you have a big heart. And Mike has such a big heart.
Mike has the biggest.
Yeah, he's the best.
Gets too involved in everything.
Yeah.
Yep. But on the good news, Rachel, you might not be alone in the studio next week. I will be 2 weeks from my second vaccine shot. So in theory, I'm fully vaccinated and free to come into the studio, and as long as I follow the protocols, I shouldn't.
You still have to wear masks, though.
Oh, I know. Yeah. I intend to wear a mask while I'm in there.
I think a lot of people
we'll just have to be 6 feet apart.
Right. They can just take the masks off, but that isn't true. I think we're going to need to wear masks for a long time.
Oh, yeah, no. I'm betting Baker will not remove the mask mandate until the state is 80% vaccinated. And that's going to be next year.
And I know
we'll see what
are
the
tired of
CDC
it, but we have to
recommendations are tomorrow.
I'm sorry? Huh?
We'll see what the CDC recommends. I think they're coming out with new recommendations.
About
they probably are.
Yeah.
But do we want to move right to the Robert Reich, the video on Robert Reich about the deficit, that the biggest deficit you've never heard of?
Sure.
I think we could do that right now, Paul, and then we can take that as a stepping point to go forward.
America has a deficit problem, but the country's biggest deficit isn't the federal budget deficit. It's the deficit in public investment. The public investment deficit is the gap between what we should be investing in our future on infrastructure, education, and basic research, and the relatively little we are investing. Increasing public investment needs to be a major goal of the Biden administration. Public investment is similar to private investment in that we invest today because of the payoff in the future. The difference is public investment pays off for all of us, for America. In the 1960s, we used to make a lot of public investments, but they've been steadily declining ever since. That decline has been largely driven by so-called deficit hawks who argue against more federal spending.
I will oppose this new debt, and I will continue to sound the alarm until we change our course.
But as I've been saying for years, reducing the federal deficit just for the sake of reducing it makes absolutely no sense.
Any business person knows that you borrow money for the sake of investing in the future of your business. Those are wise borrowings, because then you can pay those debts off when you get bigger. A national economy works in exactly the same way. It doesn't matter that we're borrowing money if we were investing those monies that we borrowed from abroad in education, training, infrastructure, factories, but we're not.
The public return on infrastructure investment, based on a 2020 report taking into account the pandemic, averages $2.70 for every single public dollar invested. Yet we haven't made those investments. Our infrastructure today is crumbling. The return on early childhood education is between 10 and 16%. But only a handful of our children have access to early childhood education. Public investment on clean energy has an annual return of over 27%, but federal tax breaks favor fossil fuels over renewables by about 7-1. The public return on investments in basic research and development are huge. America's competitiveness depends on them because no individual company has an incentive to make them. The lithium-ion battery that powers iPhones and electric cars was developed by federally sponsored materials science research, while the Internet itself was born out of the Advanced Research Projects Administration of the Defense Department. And yet, in recent years, public investment in basic research has declined as well. Are you seeing a pattern yet? Federal investments in all these areas have shrunk, even though the payoffs from these investments are gigantic, and the costs of not making them are astronomical. American productivity is already suffering. Now, some say we don't need to worry about this public investment deficit because private investments will fill the gap. Baloney. Corporations are focused on getting the best return for themselves, not for America. For decades, corporations have made money by lowering their costs at the expense of working people, capping wages, reducing taxes, and deregulating. A common assumption is that when American corporations are profitable, Americans are better off. But that's false. Trickle-down economics is a sham. Tax cuts and subsidies to big corporations and the wealthy don't build the economy. Economies don't grow from the top down, they grow from the bottom up through public investment. So if private investment won't fill the gap, how do we fill it? Two ways: tax the wealthy and large corporations, and borrow. Tax rates on the wealthy and on corporations have continued to drop over the last 40 years, just as the deficit in public investment has grown. In the 1950s, the highest tax rate on individuals was over 90%. Even after tax deductions and credits, it was still over 40%. But since then, tax rates have dropped dramatically on the wealthy. For the first time on record, the 400 richest Americans now pay a lower effective tax rate than people in the bottom half. Revenue from corporate taxes has also plummeted. If wealthy individuals and corporations want all the advantages that come with being American, they have to pay taxes so America can afford the public investments necessary for a high-wage, high-productivity society. Now, the other way to pay for public investments is through public borrowing. This kind of borrowing doesn't burden future generations because it's used to build a better future for those future generations. And remember, there's a difference between borrowing for the future and borrowing for today. You might not want to borrow to pay for a vacation, but it's perfectly rational to borrow to purchase a house because a vacation doesn't have any future return while a home does. Right now, the federal budget irrationally treats all government borrowing as the same. The government needs a public investment budget, separate from the current spending budget, to clarify what we are investing in and allow us to keep borrowing for investments as long as the returns justify it. Public investment is the biggest and most important deficit you have never heard of. Don't listen to people who claim we can't afford to invest in the American people. We can afford it. We can't afford not to. Joe Biden needs to recognize this and make public investment a central part of his economic strategy.
Well, I think I'd like to just say Maynard and I have talked about this. One of the things, and I agree with just about everything Robert Reich has said, but we've talked about, first, subsidies for corporations and welfare for people who are struggling with income inequality, going farther and farther apart. But one of the things Maynard and I have he's talked about is the military budget. And we don't have funds for the things that are needed for everyday people. Will you talk about that, Maynard?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that Robert Reich didn't mention the military budget.
Yeah.
And spending on all of those other areas, education, infrastructure, childcare, and so on, you get much more in the way of support that brings in, real jobs for people that are really being productive, building a suitable economy. And one of the nice things that just happened over the past week or so, some good labor news for a change, is that the United Mine Workers Union president, Cecil Roberts, said he's in favor of supporting the idea of a just transition, which basically means if coal miners lose their jobs, if the mines are closed down, the government will pay their wages for maybe a year and a half while they're being trained for new kinds of jobs, in a renewable kind of economy. And you may remember in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was running and she said, forget about coal miners' jobs. And she also basically said, forget about coal miners. I mean, imagine if she talked about a just transition.
She probably would have been better off.
We might have had a different outcome to that election. I just want to say one more thing in terms of what Reich was talking about. And he showed how, federal money, research money, has been important in a lot of innovations in the United States. And that's very much true in terms of the pharmaceuticals also. So the vaccines that we're getting now, in many cases, have come about through university research that's been supported by the federal government. And then the pharmaceutical companies take their patents and they get rich with it. Yep. And just one last thing on that. During the campaign, Joe Biden said, if necessary, he would ask the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to waive the patent rights of those drug companies so those drugs could be produced throughout the world. And, then everybody throughout the world would have the vaccines. Now, Biden needs to be pressured to fulfill that campaign promise. Because, you're talking about masks before, even if all Americans are vaccinated, if the rest of the world isn't, those viruses are going to spread, they're going to mutate, and we'll be back to square one again. So the whole idea of federal money being used for innovations, and then turning the results of those innovations, the money, over to corporations is something that I think we also need to really look at carefully.
Yeah, I think I looked and saw, I think the Obama administration had given $25 million in investment to Moderna to help do this research for this type of vaccine. So, we do need to invest. We need to invest in our infrastructure. We have problems in North Adams with fire hydrants. We have problems with water quality. We need new water lines. These proposals to replace all the water lines in all the communities. I mean, look at the trouble they're having in Flint, Michigan, with the lead pipes. And so all these investments, you can't, once a child gets lead in their system, it's really, it costs our society so much money to take care of that child. And just, it's inhumane besides, but these investments have to be made. I walk down Spring Street every day. It's part of my mail route, and I'll see one manhole cover and it says 1936 on it. It was part of the WPA, I mean, Roosevelt put people to work, and it worked, and it had lasting value. We're still using that.
Right. And I agree, it's time. And these are jobs that would be in the U.S. They're not jobs that can be outsourced. And you're not only investing in the present, you're investing in the future, which is what we need to do. The U.S. has been living like day to day for so long now that it almost feels like the American public has forgotten that government invested in everything that launched the corporations and businesses that enabled them to do what they wanted, because they gave them the infrastructure, the roads, the airplanes, the trains, everything else. Without them, business would not have been able to grow and expand so rapidly.
I always come back to Miss Lunny, my high school English teacher, saying the accent is on the wrong syllable. And when I hear Robert Reich talking about borrowing overseas, I'm thinking, how can we be the richest country in the world and be borrowing overseas? And I know how complicated international finance is, but we seem to have money to go to Mars or wherever we want to go, but we can't even, I mean, look what's happening in this country right now. And infrastructure, and I will say people infrastructure first, taking just what you're talking about, water, clean air, the basics of life have to be taken care of first. And those are jobs, and renewable energy are jobs. Energy, the jobs are, and there's such pushback from state governments, a lot of it state governments, on transitioning to renewable energy. And we should be way ahead of where we are, even in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, because those produce huge jobs, and you don't have to wait. They should have been working with, this country should be working with coal miners already, preparing them for solar, wind, whatever. And of course, if they can't do that, they need to pay them, as Maynard said, livable wages to propel them into this new way we have to live to save our planet.
And one thing that these investments can do, it can help also fight the systemic racism that we have in this country, the institutional racism, where we have people in poorer communities, people of color that have a lack of jobs, they have a lack of clean water and lack of a clean environment, and need new schools. And,
I believe that was an intentional systemic creation for mostly people of color. That has been going on for years and years in this country, and it is still not, redlining and all the rest of it, still not being addressed. Although I think this push-up all across the board, across this country, with Black Lives Matter, the murder of George Floyd, other murders that are happening across the country, and the fact that we've had the internet and iPhones and whatever has really opened up what we can all see, the transparency and truth we have not been seen or been able to see, or a lot of people have even been aware of because of the lack of access to find out what is really going on in our poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Dick was talking about, in Pennsylvania, we have a Democratic governor, but a conservative Republican legislature. And a lot of that comes about because of gerrymandering.
Oh, yes.
And so the cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia suffer in terms of getting money into the school systems. And they're not really organized in terms of helping the poor areas more than the wealthier areas, like a lot of other states are doing. And I mean, just in terms of the pandemic, some of the schools in Philadelphia weren't able to open simply because there's still asbestos in those schools and they have to be dealt with. And it's disproportionately, poor Black kids who go to those schools. One of the proposals that's going on right now is that to force the private utility company that produces the electricity to hire people from Philadelphia to actually put solar paneling on all of the houses and apartments in Philadelphia. I mean, right now, a very small percentage of the electricity that is produced by this utility actually, comes from solar or wind energy. So yeah, it's all connected to racism, to conservative politics, and the need for a much better infrastructure.
Yeah, the conservatives I see, mostly Republicans, the only thing they accomplish is they like tax cuts for the rich. They want to make government smaller. They don't want to make any investments in our communities. They just want tax cuts. That's all they talk about. I think it was Grover Norquist was one of the heads of the Republican Party, and he had everyone sign this tax pledge that they wouldn't vote for new taxes. And his goal was to make government so small that you could drown it in a bathtub.
Remember that, yeah.
And that goes right back to Reagan trickle-down economics, which is just a farce.
Well, think about it. We've been hearing it for 20 years. Who's better off with trickle-down economics?
20.
More than 20.
50.
Oh, well, I know. He's 1980s, right?
40 years.
40.
Close to 40. I think we've given that theory enough time to try and work out for America.
I think we've wandered in the desert of trickle-down economics for 40 years. I think it's time to get out.
Yep. Definitely.
Definitely.
So.
And, some of that, I know, Dick, you had a public higher education at UMass and North Adams State, and Liz works at the college, and I worked at the college. When I went to the University of Connecticut in the 1960s, tuition was very low, and that's because the state just paid a huge amount of the cost of running the university. And since the 80s, neoliberalism and privatization, the state budgets have been cut significantly for public higher education. So working class kids, now have to pay higher tuition, and they're stuck with these huge deficits when they graduate. Not as big as the privates, but still significant. And it's just in that one or two generations, I've seen that change take place.
Correct. Financial aid isn't about helping to educate the students anymore by lowering their costs. It's about putting a debt on them so that there's profit making off the loan.
Right, that too.
Right. There's no reason. We had a guest come from Italy, and we were telling him about the student loan process, and he's Peter's age, He said in Italy, the student loans, that means no interest. No interest. There's no interest on student loans.
No.
There's no reason in the world, all this talk about forgiveness of loans and whatever, that's great. But one thing they could just do is just eliminate the interest. Let just people pay back the principal. That would be a very simple solution. Do the other things too, but why should we be making money off of these people?
Right.
It's just not right. We have about 3 minutes left, 3 minutes and 25 seconds or so.
Well, it's always good to get a perspective from someone from a different country. You can see it could be run differently. It is possible. Sometimes we just get too sort of focused in on what we know here.
In the I agree. And Europe has always made the investment in students. most of the countries I know invest into the education network. They want their workers to be educated. They want the children to be able to fulfill the tasks that are coming in the future. They aren't trying to keep a segment down. Now, France does the same thing, that you can go to college for no cost in France if you know, I don't even think they have to sign a loan to pay back anything. It's totally free. Asian countries do it as well. They recognize the investment in education is an investment in people in the future, so that they can continue to compete, keep their edge.
If you want to visit a college 200 miles away, you don't have to drive. Get on a high-speed train.
Yeah,
right.
And they also invest in healthcare for all too.
Right.
Yes, they do.
It's universal. Everyone is covered. Everybody in, nobody out.
We have a lot of fixing to do in this country.
Right.
Yeah.
But this step with investment in the infrastructure, I think will be a good first step.
Yeah, right.
I think if we can just get everybody off the idea that infrastructure is just the roads and the bridges and that it's everything.
Yes.
Infrastructure and
taking care of elderly people that are sick, paying people a decent wage that take care of our sickest people.
That would be nice. Yes.
I think that's all part of that bill, that infrastructure bill.
Right. It is. Whether he does the whole or the second half. He was going to talk about the second half of the infrastructure bill, I believe, on Wednesday of this week in front of Congress. He was going to cover that.
And make permanent those reimbursements, the $500 or $300 a month for children.
Just like they do in Europe and Canada.
Yes.
Yeah.
No reason why. Now it's going to start in July, but then expire in January. Hopefully they can make it permanent.
Right.
Essentially, it's Social Security for children.
Right.
That's what it is. Yeah. These are the family.
We just have 30 seconds left, so maybe we have to.
We have to consider wrapping up and thanking Maynard for joining us.
Yes,
it's great to be with you in North Adams, even if it's virtually.
It's wonderful.
Well, I think they'll be happy not to see my bed, the decorations behind me on the pennants after this. So
we're going to power to the people for Mike.
Yes.
And everybody mask up. Continue doing it.
And get your shot too.
Yes.
There's power in a factory.